So we see Jesus calling the 12 together and then giving them this purpose, sending them out. And so immediately we see we're called to bring, his followers are called to bring this love and healing presence into the world. And there is both an inward and outward element to discipleship. So we see Jesus give this authority to them, but also there's a vulnerability that we see in this instruction. They're 2 by 2, but they're not meant to have a bread with them, a bag, money. So there's this radical dependence that comes with this. And having done this long walk, I realized the importance of traveling light on the Camino. I took really nothing at all. But one thing it does force you to do is embrace hospitality from people. Welcome to Thread. I'm Hannah DeSouza.
And I'm Dr. David Pocta. Each week, we journey into the story of Scripture through the lens of Christian spirituality.
Whether you're new to the Bible or have read it for years, our hope is that these conversations will help you find your place in God's story.
We're more than a podcast. Download the Thread podcast app. We've created daily devotionals, small group guides, and family resources for each episode. Learn about how your whole church can join the Thread journey at threadpodcast.org.
We're so glad you're on this journey with us. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Thread. We're in our 4th of 6 episodes on the Gospel of Mark, and today's episode is going to be on the topic of calling or discipleship. What calling to follow Jesus look like for his disciples, and what the calling should look like also for us as his followers today. I should say it's very good to be back with you all. I know I've
Hannah,
been away.
you're back.
I'm back. I missed
Tell
you
us
all.
where you've been.
Well, I have been on a pilgrimage of sorts. I've been, it's called the Camino de Santiago. Some of you may have heard of it. It's an ancient Christian pilgrimage route across Spain. So people have been walking it for thousands of years from different points of Europe, but all leading up to Santiago, which tradition says the remains of the Apostle James are buried. So that was historically a reason why people undertook this pilgrimage. But today people walk it for many reasons: spiritual, cultural, physical challenge, just the ability to slow down. So it's 800 kilometers is the route I walked, or 500 miles. And I did it in 35 days. Dave, I heard you refer to it as a walkabout in one of the early episodes. It's more than a walkabout. It was a lot of hours.
Fair enough. It's more than a walkabout, yes. But I think I said at one point, Hannah's gone on a walkabout.
You did, yeah.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, no, it was a lot. Very physically and spiritually and mentally stretching. But I'm sure some of the lessons I learned will come into the podcast.
I'm sure. Yeah, we're looking forward to hearing a lot about that. You were missed.
I won't leave you again.
Right. We'll see. We did have some fun co-hosts over the last few episodes, or I think 5 or 6 episodes. So it'll be fun for you to actually be able to hear all those. But it's so good to have you back. And you're going to be leading us this conversation, aren't you?
Yes, I will. And as I said, this is all on calling. And we're going to unpack in this episode what it means to follow a Messiah who defies our expectations. So not a triumphant conqueror, but a suffering servant, and a Messiah who demands as well inner transformation, not just outer conformity. So I know I've been away for a while, and I'm curious if you're able just to offer a quick recap of where we've been in Mark, mainly for me, probably.
Right, yeah. Else. Well, you know what's been different about Mark? With Matthew, you and I traveled through the gospel using the kind of the narratives, and we followed a couple streams of this narrative as it unpacked in Matthew's gospel. We broke it into 8 episodes, and we talked about conflict and with the religious leaders, and we talked about Jesus as the great teacher and the 5 sermons and all that. What we've been doing with Mark is looking at it a bit more thematically. So Mark, the first episode we did was all looking at Exodus, how Jesus comes as the liberator and led a new Exodus, a spiritual Exodus. So that was great. We had Hannah and Tacho. My daughter Hannah was on for that episode. And then we did our second episode on crowds. and just talked about the role that crowds play in the ministry of Jesus. It was really good to just kind of unpack all those kind of various things. And we did a whole episode on battles and the spiritual battles that we fight, conflicts with demons and our own hearts. And so we've had Darren and Sharon Gauthier on from Chicago. We had Robert Carrillo on last episode. So it's been a really good mix. It's good to have you back to talk about calling.
Yes, and we're going to break it down into his calling as first as commission and communal, as something that's costly, as something that requires compassion, and then as confrontation or transformation, and finally as confession. I've tried to make it snappy with the alliteration with the C's so we can remember it. But I guess we can begin because we're covering chapters 6 through 8. And starting with calling as commission and communal, we're going to look at the sending of the 12, which begins in verse 7, chapter 6. So maybe you could read that for us, Dave.
Jesus called the 12 and began to send them out 2 by 2. He gave them authority over unclean spirits. He ordered them to take nothing for their journey except a staff, no bread, no bag, no money in their belts, but to wear sandals and to not put on 2 tunics.
So we see Jesus calling the 12 together and then giving them this purpose, sending them out. And so immediately we see we're called to bring, his followers are called to bring this love and healing presence into the world. And there is both an inward and outward element to discipleship. So we see Jesus give this authority to them, but also there's a vulnerability that we see in this instruction. They're 2 by 2, but they're not meant to have a bread with them, a bag, money. So there's this radical dependence that comes with this. And having done this long walk, I realized the importance of traveling light on the Camino. I took really nothing at all. But one thing it does force you to do is embrace hospitality from people, because you kind of have to show up at a hostel. You haven't got food with you. You borrow their bed sheets and you have to borrow things from different people. And there is a community that forms when you're traveling light, needing to depend on one another. So that stood out to me actually, now more so, that idea of traveling light. So there's this simplicity and authority. So we see discipleship being introduced as something about something that's about God's provision, but there's not a self-sufficiency there. Yeah, what do you think about these instructions?
You know, it's one of the most compelling and beautiful things about discipleship. And I remember as a young man, I was 20 years old when I really started understanding this call to give my life to the cause. And you know, it reminds me a lot in Matthew's gospel and the Sermon on the Mount when we had that, when you kind of discover the kingdom and you're willing to sell everything for it. So there's an internal compelling vision of being about something that makes carrying other things with you less valuable. So I think it's still such an important calling for us to really think about this call to mission, and it's not glamorous. It's risky. It, as you say, it makes us dependent. It's uncomfortable, and all that's good.
Yeah, no, definitely. These instructions here are radical in many ways, and I've been reading a commentary on Mark written by N.T. Wright. I think the book is called Mark for Everyone. But he describes these instructions as emergency instructions for a swift and dangerous mission. And N.T. Wright says they were specific to Jesus' own day and the setting of his mission in first century Palestine. He writes, "Off go the 12, symbolic of God's renewed people, driving out evil before them, awakening memories of old prophecies of the sick being healed as the kingdom came." Jesus, it seems, was doing 3 things. He was gathering support. He was giving as many as possible a final chance to repent before the great moment came, and he was preparing the ground for the very different work that would take place in the aftermath of the great catastrophe. So he's kind of painting this picture as like the kingdom is coming and there's an urgency, and the circumstances is it's a state of emergency, I guess. I'm curious what you think about N.T. Wright's kind of commentary here. What can we as Christians today learn from these instructions when it comes to our own spirituality? Of course, we don't want to diminish the calling, but I think what N.T. Wright is kind of suggesting at here is that this was a specific time, and so these instructions maybe were more catered to the time that they were in. And so what would they look like in a different time in history and different culture and different countries? And yeah.
N.T. Wright, he's one of my favorites. I love him. I think he's so brilliant and insightful. But it's interesting. I felt some pushback with this quote, some disagreement with this. I mean, I agree with what he's saying about what these texts meant, that this vital carrying of the mission in a time when Jesus was a brand new thing to people. But I still absolutely believe that's our calling today. And I think there's a lot of application. I've lived the application of this. You've lived the application of this. And not only, right out of the gate as a young Christian, feeling the need to help people come to know Jesus in ways they didn't know Jesus, but even in more profound, deeper callings, our move to Africa, we moved to South Africa back in 2010. And I think of all the sacrifices for me for years and years, and I know for decades, so many Christians have given not only to the work themselves, to this calling of helping people know Jesus, but have given financially to missions work around the world. So, I was an engineering student at the University of Minnesota and felt this call to ministry. And it really was about that. It was really about wanting people to know Jesus the way that I had come to know him. So to me, it's huge today. It's huge today. So these postures carry us all into this call to be missionaries as followers of Jesus. And I think it's one of the things that I love so much about this tradition or fellowship that you and I are part of, that's been such a prominent part of our spirituality, an important prominent part. And I would even argue that the only reason I'm here today, and I would say, knowing your story, the only reason you're here today is because others listened to that call and reached out for it, in our own lives.
Yeah, I totally am with you there. I think the essence of these instructions are still very much true for us today. Maybe less sandals and staffs.
Right.
But
there you go.
Still applicable.
Yes.
Something else we're going to go into here is the idea of calling as costly. And we're going to look at 14 to 29 of verses 14 to 29 of chapter 6, where right after the disciples are sent out, we're told of King Herod's reaction to this spreading of the new kingdom through Jesus and his disciples. And I can read this part here where it says, King Herod heard of it, for Jesus' name had become known. Some were saying, John the Baptizer has been raised from the dead, and for this reason these powers are at work in him. But others said it is Elijah, and others said it is a prophet like one of the prophets of old. But when Herod heard of it, he said, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised. So, and then Mark goes on to recall the story of John the Baptist's death, which we read in Matthew's Gospel also. And it seems like in recalling this story about John, it's like Mark wants us to see that this is where calling can lead to. And that was a gruesome end for John. And certainly we see the cost of calling, the cost of discipleship in that story. And it will play out in the lives of Mark and the other disciples too.
Yeah, as we shared in Matthew's Gospel, John the Baptist's death foreshadows Jesus' death. And I think it also, we see many of the ways that followers of Jesus become very aware and are subject to the powers of this world, which that's one of the really kind of frightening aspects of all this. And I think that's one of the things that the disciples really struggled with then, and I think we really struggle with now. is, okay, we're entering this other kingdom where God is the king, and yet we're still under the influence of the leaders of the world. We still are subject to, in this case, Herod's weaknesses or Herodias's vengeance or the injustice of power. And that's hard as disciples, right? In this world, we're still influenced and impacted by our culture, our context, our political situation, our context of where we're born and grow up. And we don't escape that. And I think that's part of the difficulty of this tension in calling. We're called to this spiritual calling, but we're still subject to the physical realities around us and how we think about that.
That's really, that's so true. That tension of being citizens of this new kingdom while also being citizens of this worldly kingdom, this just by nature of the world that we're in and the powers that we're all. N.T. Wright, in this same commentary I've referred to, he talks about how this new kingdom of God was starting to force the kingdoms of the world to take notice. And he poses this question: if we desire or design to be kingdom agents in our own world, what should we be doing that the powers of the world would hear about it and scratch their heads in puzzlement? And are we prepared for the result? Which I think are really challenging questions as we see King Herod kind of react to this coming kingdom.
You know, in the first episode on Mark's gospel, we talked a lot about the background of Mark and how martyrdom became such a significant part of the early Christian story. And you know, we've already discussed how John the Baptist and Jesus were both killed for their faith. But under Nero in 64 AD, we talked in that first episode in Mark about the terrible things Nero did to persecute and torture and kill Christians. And, you know, we also see that background of that in the book of Revelation. Clearly there was persecution happening. But by the middle of the 3rd century, there would become this systematic empire-wide persecution of Christians. And I think it's just always an important reminder for us that this meaningful calling to compassion, love, and a call to change the world for Jesus comes with a significant resistance by the world. So following Jesus means being willing to walk this same path of sacrifice that so many have gone before us and walked.
I think that's a good segue into this next point, calling as compassion. And we see this also in chapter 6 as Jesus embodies this compassion to his followers, to the disciples and to the crowds. And we'll begin with this kind of intimate moment with the apostles. Maybe you can read this part here, Dave.
Mark 6:30-32. The apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. He said to them, "Come away with me to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest for a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And when they went away in a boat to a deserted place by themselves.
I love this little moment here when we see the disciples report back to Jesus all that had taken place. And I just imagine it was a very lively discussion as they're all chiming in with the different things they've seen, the things God has done through them, the victories, as I'm sure the defeats and persecutions as well. But what I really love is Jesus' response to this, which is, come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while. And this goes back to the idea of calling as both internal and external, inward and outward. And Jesus recognizes the need for this inner renewal after they've had this outward focus. And he recognizes their need to take care of their physical bodies too, to rest and to eat. And I love this compassion that he shows here for them.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, ministry work, whether you're paid to do it or you're not paid to do it, just as Christians, it's amazing and beautiful being an ambassador of love and compassion is one of the great gifts that we're given as Christians. And we've been in these situations like the disciples are where you're just recalling, wow, look what God did through our work and ministry. And I think that's one of the beauties of being a Christian. We're allowed to partake and participate in this ministry of reconciliation, as Paul calls it. But as we all know who've participated in this, people are messy. Getting
Mm-hmm.
involved and pouring ourselves into other people's lives is exhausting. And when we don't take care of ourselves, that also becomes a problem. And ministry burnout, compassion fatigue, for so many people is a real thing who genuinely give themselves. And I think there's an important lesson here about a recognition that we got to take care of ourselves because compassion fatigue's real.
Yes, it's so true. I remember we studied a book in my congregation in London called Zeal Without Burnout by Christopher Ashe. And I recommend it. It was a good book. I love that the subtitle was 7 Keys to a Lifelong Ministry of Sustainable Sacrifice. And I like that it should be sustainable. So the passage here continues in verse 33. It says, "Now many saw them going." So the crowds now are seeing the disciples pulling away.
No
And
vacation
it
for
says,
you.
yes. And it says they hurried there on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. As he went ashore, Jesus, he saw a great crowd and he had compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. So it seems like it's hard for the disciples to catch a break with these crowds. This story shows us so much of the heart of Jesus, I think, for me. His ability to look out at this crowd following them and not be irritated. And we've spoken about this in earlier episodes, but to have that compassion, to see in each face reflecting a different need, hunger or hurt. And he recognized both their need for more teaching as well as physical sustenance. And I love that part. I think Jesus' ministry is one that sees and should see still today both spiritual and physical needs. And sometimes we can overemphasize one or the other. But we see this then, the miracle that then takes place, which is the famous feeding of the 5,000. Some commentaries have seen the feeding of the 5,000 with these 12 baskets left over as representing Jesus' ministry to the Jewish world. So with the 12 tribes. And later, we'll see at the start of chapter 8, the feeding of the 4,000 with the 7 baskets left over. And some scholars think that represents the promise to the wider Gentile world, the 70 nations in Jewish folklore, or sometimes this number 7 is interpreted as representing completeness or God's provision for all humanity, symbolized by the 7 days of creation. So it's not obvious what Mark's intent is there with those numbers, but Jesus feeds all, and there's more left over, which I love that principle. I also really love that Jesus invites the disciples to participate in this miracle. They have clearly had enough, and they want to send the crowds away to get food, but Jesus says, you give them something to eat. What do you think, Dave, he wants maybe the disciples to learn from participating and not just witnessing this miracle, and what perhaps his implications there for us?
Yeah, he forces them to look at what they have to give. And this is the heart of Jesus, is he's not going to come fix everything. He wants us to participate in this process. This is our ministry together. So there's such an important lesson here. So the disciples, they see the need. It's overwhelming, right? They don't believe they have the resources to meet this need. They're in a deserted place. It's late. The people are hungry. And Jesus says, take inventory. What do you have? Like, just what is it that you do have? And what we learn so much from this is the importance of this communal Christian service. If we are able to give what we have to offer, Jesus will multiply it and meet the needs and beyond. And I'm just constantly amazed at that and how God uses us to multiply his efforts with the little we have to give, if we really give it, to impact the world. And he did it then, he's doing it now. But that's really the heart of the lesson here, I think.
We also see calling as confrontation. or transformation. I think we're going to discuss both. And after this miracle, the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus sends the disciples ahead by boat in verse 45 of chapter 6, while he goes up the mountain to pray. And then we see a storm rises, they're straining at the oars, and Jesus comes walking out to them on the water, and they are terrified. And we have this moment here where Jesus says, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." It's interesting reading the story and then picturing how that must have been with the storm raging. Like, did his voice just amplify over that? I'm not sure. Or was it more internal? It must have been, a sight to behold. Because Mark comments on it by saying they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened, which is interesting. He refers back to this miracle and their misunderstanding. And he says their hearts were hardened, which perhaps echoes the language we've seen in Exodus of Pharaoh's heart being hard. I'm curious, Dave, what you make of even Mark saying that their hearts were hardened. So the disciples have just seen the bread and the fish being multiplied, and yet they still cannot trust who Jesus is, it seems, from this moment here. And we see that calling confronts us. Do we want a Messiah who is easily explainable, safe, controllable? Or are we willing to follow one who maybe unsettles us, who walks on water, defies our expectations? And this is actually a lesson I felt like hit me on the Camino, actually. People say the most mentally challenging part of the Camino is called the Meseta, which maybe you hit this part at day 23, around then, and it's just a long stretch of the plains of the center of Spain. So it's incredibly hot. There's no shade. It lasts maybe 8 to 9 days. There's no shops. You have to prepare and stash all the things you need for this kind of journey. And after it, you'll reach the highest point on the Camino, which is called the Cruz de Ferro, or the Iron Cross, and there is literally a cross there, and it's of symbolic significance to pilgrims because there is a pile of rocks at the bottom of this cross, and people typically bring a rock from home and they write something on it. And it's meant to be a kind of a burden to let go of, or just something they want to put at the foot of this cross. And I didn't know what to put on my rock, but I brought it from home and I carried it all the way up to that point. And on the Meseta, I was, maybe, Dave, this is all your wilderness theology, I was very excited actually for this part of the pilgrimage, because it reminded me of the wilderness, and which many people do say is transformative. Some people skip it and take the bus, which you shouldn't do.
Right.
I do think there's a transformative part of just this barren land. And I began it very upbeat. I was singing and praying. There's no one for miles around. But kind of reaching the last day of that Meseta, I really felt broken. And my prayers started to sound a bit angry as just, I think, different questions, or maybe disappointments, or theological questions, even all these different feelings that maybe the busyness of life just masks over. I feel like all these kind of things started to bubble to the surface, and I was trying to find God in it. And actually, this is the power of thread, actually, because something I kept repeating as I was walking was Hineni, which I know we've come up a lot on thread. It's that idea of, I'm here, God, speak to me. And also I would repeat that line in 1 Samuel, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. So I really felt like I wanted to hear what God wanted to say to me. And I just kept repeating those two things. And I think maybe the frustration came when I felt like there was external and internal silence to those petitions to God to kind of speak to me or guide me. A lot of people say they find God on the Meseta, because people do say that. Why does it feel like I'm losing him? Some things that came up for me was, perhaps I need to let go of an image of God that I've held on to. How I expect him to work in my life and in the world. This image of God maybe shaped by other people's expectations, or a God I've tried to control or predict since childhood through good behavior, right doctrine. I think of that spirit of the older brother in the parable of the prodigal son, like trying to control the outcome. This God I unconsciously expected to bless me if I did everything right. And I kind of had this realization that maybe I'm ready to I need to let that image of God go. because I want the living God, this unpredictable God that we're just seeing here that walks on water, wild, uncontrollable, that presence of the Spirit hovering over the surface of the deep at creation. I had this moment where I'm like, if I'm going to follow you, I want to follow you, not the version of you that's palatable to me. And so I stopped at this point in the Meseta. I found a little bush, and I described this as my like Elijah moment because I found some shade. It was a tiny circle of shade, and I sat under it. And I pulled out my rock from my bag, and I wrote on it God with a lowercase g. And that was kind of my moment. Like, I think this is what I need to lay at the foot of this iron cross, is this image of God that maybe the way I've wanted him to be in order to embrace who he really is. So that's what I laid at the Cristofero, that rock. So I share that to say, I think, the calling to follow Jesus, it's a calling to follow him and not who we want him to be, not the Jesus of our own image or our own making, but who he reveals himself to be in the scriptures.
We bring the church to everyone, every day. Thread podcast and app are designed to deepen faith, foster spiritual growth, and equip ministry leaders to create unified, mature, Christ-centered churches. Thread podcast unites the church and deepens discipleship from the youngest children to the most mature members. Start your transformation at threadpodcast.org.
The temptation for us is to see God in those moments where he worked through us in a ministry. He fed the 5,000 to gather around Jesus and share all the great stories as the disciples did about how they saw demons respond and people healed. And certainly God works in all that, and there's no doubt. But when you talk about calling and discipleship, it's the long stretches. It's the barren times. It's the wilderness moments that God also speaks. And I've been saying on the podcast for quite a while now, God does God's best work in wilderness. God does God's best work in silence. God does God's best work in the long stretches. It's because he exposes us and he peels it all back and he forces us to look at things. It literally was my prayer this morning. It's even things like, okay, we started Thread 2 years ago, and there's all this enthusiasm and excitement, and whenever things are new and you see the impact and what it's doing, a new job, all of it, like, it's easy. It's the long, barren stretches that test our calling. So I appreciate you bringing that out. I think that's a huge part of calling. I think the Spirit, sometimes the Spirit, I had a couple quotes just thinking about the wildness of this story, Jesus walking on water, being caught off guard, which is also how the Spirit works. Mark Batterson says, following the Holy Spirit's like chasing a wild goose. It will always be unpredictable. It will often feel uncontrollable. It will never be boring. Erwin McManus does a lot of work certainly on masculine spirituality and calling, but he says the Spirit of God is not safe, but he is good. If you follow him, he will lead you to dangerous places where only faith makes sense. And I think, again, that applies to both the great, I'm giving up everything and taking one suitcase and moving across the world, but it's also in those quiet moments that the Holy Spirit brings us to spaces that we're not prepared to go, and that often catches us off guard and clears all that away. Anyway, there's a lot there.
It's true. There is a lot there. Actually, I love those quotes you shared. They remind me of, and Jesus will say this in the Gospel of John, the wind blows wherever it pleases. You hear the sound, cannot tell where it comes from, where it is going. So it is with everyone born of the Spirit. There's that unpredictable nature of having a Spirit-led life, which is this calling to follow Jesus. It's hard to predict, but you're right, it's never boring.
Never boring. And there's countless examples of people in my life and your life who've listened to the Spirit in the quiet moments and in the loud moments and have done all kinds of things as a result. I think of you going to Europe to minister on a border country of Ukraine when the war broke out. I think of moving in 2010 to South Africa with my 12 and 14-year-old daughters in the middle of their high school years, or after 26 years of being in ministry, stepping out to go pursue a degree with no guaranteed income. I mean, sometimes, and it was in those were wilderness moments that God spoke to me, and they're scary moments. I come to call them God's grand gestures. These kind of moments when the Holy Spirit speaking loudly to you and calling you to something deeper.
I love that. Yeah, it is this inner transformation that Jesus is calling us to. And we're going to see now in this next story, this idea of the spiritual battle isn't just with external forces, all these storms, outer storms, but it's within, and we see it within the disciples. The next story we see is about this washing of hands, and Jesus starts to teach on inner purity, inner holiness, as much as outer purity and outer holiness. And I can read here in Mark 7, verse 5. It says, "So the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, 'Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?' He said to them, 'Isaiah prophesied rightly about you hypocrites. As it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You abandon the commandment of God and hold to human tradition.'" And he goes on, and it's a convicting passage. And it's clear that the Pharisees here found security and comfort in their rules and ritual compliance. But Jesus confronts this and makes it clear that calling is not about managing appearances, keeping up purity codes. It's about deep transformation of the heart. And the disciples and us must confront that our problem isn't primarily out there or the storms without, but also within. It begins within. And Jesus goes on to reiterate this lesson then for his disciples too, after the crowds have left. And presumably, I'm guessing they ask him about it. And he says in verse 18 of chapter 7, "Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile?" And he goes on to say it's what comes out of a person that defiles. For it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come. And then he lists the different things that come from within and defile a person. And yeah, I think this is a high calling for us in our churches today, because it is possible to do all the right things, in quote, outwardly, and in fact, be far from God and the heart of God, which is scary to think about. What do you think about this, Dave, and the way we might be tempted to find security in this outward compliance and traditions, but perhaps neglect this inner transformation?
I think we have to be sympathetic with the people he's confronting here, not in any way to excuse where they find themselves, but rather because these are real temptations and challenges that we find as we grow older in the faith. There's a radicalness about initially following Jesus. Scholars call it the first fervor. And we all have stories of our initial zeal and enthusiasm, but we also have horror stories about how we mishandled that zeal, usually with our families, but certainly with friends and others. But over time, it's really easy to start doing the outward things and not focus on the inner life. And I think that's something we have to constantly be concerning ourselves with, is our sense of being, our inner life, as we continue to focus on those outer things and calling to service and ministry. But it's a real challenge that we certainly understand.
Definitely. And we're going to conclude here this topic of calling with calling as confession. And by confession, we're talking about this moment at Caesarea Philippi in chapter 8 where Jesus asks them who they believe the Messiah is. And this confession we hear from Peter. In our episode on the Messiah Jesus, we talked about the disciples needing to confront the ways in which Jesus was different from the expectations they had about who the Messiah would be and how he would act in their world. And this will become a crucial part of the calling of discipleship, this acknowledgement or confession that Jesus is Lord. And we see this confession from Peter in verse 27. Jesus asks them, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answer him, "John the Baptist. Others say Elijah. Still others, one of the prophets." He asks them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And then it says he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him, which perhaps people have questions about. I know I did when I first read this passage. Why And I'm going to ask you, Dave, why does Jesus order them, do you think, not to tell anyone about him? Because surely people might think this was a part of the outward mission to proclaim Jesus as the Messiah. And my second question I'll ask is, what do you think is the significance of this moment here for the disciples? Jesus, just Peter, I should say, responds with, "You are the Messiah," but presumably they're all starting to gain this conviction now that Jesus is not just announcing a new kingdom, but is the king of this kingdom.
Yeah, those are related questions for sure. It brings up what is often referred to in the book of Mark as the Messianic secret. Jesus is performing miracles. He's casting out demons. Even people, specifically his disciples, who start recognizing he's the Messiah, but then he says, "Don't reveal my identity." In fact, it's so strong that in Mark's gospel that he commands silence, right? When the demons recognize him as the Holy One or the Son of God, or after healing people, he tells them, "Don't tell other people." Of course, we see Peter here seeing he's the Messiah. He says, "Don't tell anyone yet." And there is a reason in Mark's narrative for this, that when we step back and we look, and we even go back to the crowds episode that we did, we see that there's a different perception by different groups. The religious people are struggling to understand. They certainly don't see it. The people don't really see it. The disciples are just starting to see it. And I think there's a couple underlying things that Jesus is trying to get straightened out that Mark's bringing out. One of them is just this theme of today, the understanding of what Messiah is, this idea that this is a triumphalistic king that's going to drive out our enemies. Jesus is trying to really work on his inner circle to get them to understand that's not it. And we see this impulse. People want to make him king. Jesus is trying to slow roll that, right? We can't jump ahead. You're going to misunderstand what I'm doing. We don't want this thing to get out of control. So there's a lot of restraint there. I think it also, this kind of secret concept emphasizes that true recognition of Jesus comes through faith and revelation and the calling of discipleship, the way of the cross, not from miracles, not from public acclaim or popularity. So that becomes a really important backstory here that is unfolding. So this resolution of the secret really plays out at the cross. And Jesus, in Mark, there's 3 specific times Jesus says that, okay, you get it? So here's what it means. It means that I'm going to suffer and die, and then I'll resurrect. So we see through the cross and the resurrection a full understanding of Jesus's way, the way of suffering. So this tension between this hidden messiahship and a public misunderstanding is actually meant to prevent a premature or false understanding of who Jesus is and his identity. So there's a lot happening here, right? And we're right at that kind of pivot point. This part of Mark's gospel is actually considered the pivot point. These 3 verses there's the before and now we move to the cross. And so this is a really good place for us to kind of narrow in and land this plane, because that's exactly what's happening here.
So as we conclude, then, what I see Mark showing us is that calling is never just about what we do for Jesus, changing outward behavior, but it's about who we become as we follow him. So we're sent out together in community and dependence, like the 12. We're warned that calling can be costly, as it was for John. We're invited to bring our little, what we have, and trust in the provision of Jesus for the rest. And this calling also confronts us. It confronts our desire for a Messiah who will simply make life easier, calmer, perhaps more successful. It confronts the ways we cling to control, to outward appearances, to safe religion. Instead, this calling draws us into the uncomfortable but life-giving work of letting Jesus reshape our hearts so we can live as his kingdom agents. I like that phrase from N.T. Wright. Bearing witness to a Messiah who rules through compassion, service, conviction, humility, and self-giving love. And we're going to continue, I'm sure, expanding on this idea of calling, because it's a theme throughout the Gospels.
It is. And I think in our next episode, what'll be really great to kind of parallel this is the idea of grace, and how grace plays an integral role in our discipleship, which it's one of the most misunderstood, maybe unappreciated aspects of this whole thing is God's grace. So it'll be good to talk about that next episode. Hannah, it's so good to be back with you as co-host.
Thank you.
Really good to have you back and good to hear all the things that you learned on this journey. And we'll see everyone back for episode 60. Can you believe it? Episode 60.
Okay.
So we'll see you next time.
See you then. Thanks so much for joining this Thread conversation.
Remember, we're more than just a podcast. Explore threadpodcast.org and Thread Podcast app for daily devotionals, small group guides, family content, and more. All designed to help you weave God's story into your life.
See you next time on Thread.